In this special episode of Behind the Headlines of History, Michaela and I look for stories that are relevant to the season. What I've done is, because, we're coming up to Christmas, I've actually looked at a newspaper from Christmas Eve, and it is the Glasgow Herald, and it's Thursday, 24th of December, 1891. And I picked this story because the headline pulled me in, and it was "The Loss of a Guion Liner. Details of the disaster." Now, Guion was a shipping company, and the ship itself was called the Abyssinia. Why was this interesting? Because in this particular article, you're getting some first-hand accounts of what happened. And why I liked it was because no one died.
Okay. Well, that's quite an uplifting...
Yeah, it was very uplifting. So the Abyssinia, it's coming from New York on its way. It's doing the sort of New York, Queenstown, Liverpool route that was very common. It didn't have a lot of people on it. I think there's about 147 people in total, but 59 of those were passengers and the rest were crew. But it also had on board a whole batch of cotton bales, which was packed full of cotton bales. So it was a cargo and a mailer. Anyway, it gets out. It's about 1,500 miles in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, and it's 1:30 in the afternoon on the 18th of December, and the captain notices that one of the cotton bales is on fire. And so, they go down, the crew gets there, they can't put it out.
Why?
Well, because it just gets away from it. It becomes engulfed in flame. The passengers are helping to try and put it out. You can remember, these guys are in the middle of the North Atlantic. Sure, they had enough room on the lifeboats for everyone, but the seas were actually really bad and the conditions were terrible. So it must have been quite, alarming for everyone. And I'm not sure whether this is a massive sort of twist of fate or a stroke of luck, or it just gives you some indication of how busy those shipping lanes were. But there was another boat twice the size called the Spree that saw the smoke and went to their rescue and was able to rescue everyone without any loss of life. And that must have been, for the passengers and the crew on that must have been like that was a miracle that someone was actually close enough to see them and to save them. And so I wanted to see what I could find out a little bit more about what was going on. And of course, the article is great in that it just gives you all this detail. Now, I want to read out a little bit of it. One of the second engineers, his name was actually John Preacher, and he said, "My wife has to thank the Germans for the best Christmas box she has ever had." Now, I'm guessing that's him returning home safely.
Yeah. Oh, bless.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say, "This is the third time I've been in a fire at sea." It's like, what?
Oh my goodness, you just would not want to get on a boat with him, would you? If he said, "I'm getting on your boat," you'd go, "It's all right."
So I'm thinking, okay, well, that ship was destroyed, so potentially there's a passenger manifest that's just gone missing.
Right, okay.
But no, I actually found all the crew and all the passengers listed at the back of the passenger list for the Spree. So all those details are there. And the wonderful Mr. Preacher actually gives us a little bit more of a story about just what it was like for those people that were picked up. This is what Mr. Preacher has to say. He says, I shall never forget the scene at Southampton when we left the Spree. The crew had their band on deck and it played all the time while we were getting on the tender, which is the boat that would take them to the shore. We responded with cheers. And I can tell you that many of us even cried. So grateful were we for what they had done for us. We only regretted that we could not give more proof of our feeling towards them. Imagine sitting there by the fire at Christmas, reading the newspaper and reading this really positive story that came out of what was potential tragedy and drama and so close to Christmas. And then here it is, all these people saved and all looked after and cared for and brought back home at a time when, disasters at sea were probably quite common.
You know what I think is really interesting as well, which is why it's always worth, isn't it, checking newspapers? Because if you were looking for your family on the original ship, you wouldn't have found them. because they were on a completely different ship. But if you hadn't have looked in the newspapers to find out, well, that ship was destroyed by fire, so that's why they're on another ship, then, you wouldn't have known that, would you? And potentially you could have been looking at the wrong record. So that's why I always think, like, whenever you're doing your family tree, just always look in the newspapers for everything.
Yeah, I always do that, Michaela. Whenever I come across an immigration record that obviously has the ship name on it, straight over to the newspapers and look for details about the ship, when it arrived, what might have been on board. Sometimes they mention the names of passengers. Sometimes they mention things that happen. It's almost as good as being able to get the ship's log.
Yeah, what an interesting story. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our little catch up today.
Always wonderful to spend some time chatting about what we find in the newspaper.